If you think the world is being controlled by mega banks like JP Morgan, asset managers like BlackRock, tech giants like Microsoft, or unaccountable international organizations like the World Economic Forum, then you are wrong. What if I told you that there's an entity even bigger than all of these institutions? Before you know the organization, you need to go back to 1800s. Once upon a time, the world was far from peaceful, with constant wars and conflicts causing disruption. After the Napoleonic Wars in the 1800s, major powers in Europe attempted to create a period of peace by forming the Concert of Europe in 1815. It was the very first international organization tasked with preventing member countries from going to war. However, the Concert of Europe eventually started to crumble, and it completely fell apart when World War I erupted in 1914. But the idea of international cooperation for peace had been set. After World War I ended in 1918, the powers that tried to establish a period of peace, again with the League of Nations in 1920. This time, the League of Nations had broader goals beyond just preventing war, including promoting human rights and labor conditions. Unfortunately, the League of Nations did not last very long, collapsing when World War II began in 1939, less than 20 years later. But the concept of international collaboration for peace and progress continued. By the end of World War II in 1945, the United Nations had effectively come into being, although it was officially founded a month after the war's end. Like its predecessors, the UN was founded by the powerful nations of the time, initially comprising 50 countries. Today it includes nearly every country on the planet, totaling 193 members. Just like the League of Nations, the UN's primary mission was to maintain peace, but its charter included a laundry list of other goals to keep its member countries engaged. These additional goals involved humanitarian efforts and fostering international cooperation on global issues. This is where it gets interesting, because if you claim to have global issues, you can justify global solutions. And the only way to achieve global solutions is by having a single global government, which is essentially what the UN represents. Logically, this would require a single global currency, a global military, and much more. As a matter of fact, the UN established its own military in 1948, shortly after its foundation. The UN began its first so-called peacekeeping mission in 1956. Then, after the Cold War ended in 1988, the UN's military purpose expanded from keeping tensions in countries under control to keeping people under control. Case in point, the UN recently announced the creation of a digital army to fight misinformation and disinformation on social media platforms. This digital army's mission is to combat information that hinders progress toward the Sustainable Development Goals. For context, the SDGs consist of 17 goals that all member countries must achieve by 2030. This is why you've likely seen the year 2030 mentioned frequently, and it's also why countries are rushing to implement digital IDs, central bank, digital currencies, CBDCs, and smart cities. The SDGs mandate the implementation of these technologies by 2030. The clock is ticking, and the UN and its affiliates are hurrying to reach the finish line. To comprehend who controls the UN, we need to understand how it operates. The UN consists of 6 major organs: the General Assembly, the Security Council, the Economic and Social Council, the Secretariat, the International Court of Justice, and the Trusteeship Council. For the purposes of this discussion, we can ignore the International Court of Justice and the Trusteeship Council, as they are not central to the UN's dynamics. The General Assembly is composed of representatives from the UN's 193 member countries, who meet each September to discuss and vote on resolutions. Important resolutions require a 2/3 majority to pass, while less significant resolutions require a simple majority of over 50%. The Security Council, on the other hand, consists of 15 countries, with 5 having permanent seats and 10 rotating every 2 years. These 5 permanent members, which are France, Russia, China, the United States, and the United Kingdom, hold a unique power within the UN. They have the ability to veto significant UN resolutions, and this power has been a source of controversy. The veto means these countries can reject any UN resolution that adversely affects their interests. The United States in particular insisted on having this veto power during the UN's formation, and it is unlikely to be removed anytime soon. One example of the Security Council's power is the attempt by the US to pass a resolution authorizing the invasion of Iraq after the 9/11 attacks. The resolution was rejected by the UN, but the US invaded Iraq regardless. It is essential to remember that none of the Security Council's members' hands are entirely clean when it comes to global control. They have all been involved in power struggles and conflicts. Now, you may be curious about who is in the driver's seat at the UN. To answer this question, we must understand how the UN functions. The Secretariat, often regarded as the administrative body of the UN, plays a central role in crafting, passing, and implementing UN resolutions. The leader of the Secretariat, known as the Secretary General, is nominated by the Security Council and elected by the General Assembly every 5 years. One notable aspect of the Secretary General's role is that it has no term limit, although no one has served more than 2 terms so far. This is an important position because the Secretary General wields significant influence in shaping and implementing UN policies. The interesting part is that the selection of the Secretary General can reveal who truly holds the reins of power within the UN. It turns out that the UN underwent a transformation in the early 1990s. You see, passing resolutions requires either a 2/3 majority vote or a majority vote. Every member country, regardless of its financial contribution to the UN, has an equal vote in this process. This voting system is more significant than you might realize because it means that the country that influences most other countries can effectively gain control of the UN. In the early 1990s, it appeared that the balance of power was shifting toward the developing world within the UN. The US and its allies were not pleased with this development. The Secretary General at that time, Boutros Boutros-Ghali of Egypt, was opposed by the US, to the extent that they even offered to create a non-profit foundation for him if he stepped down. He refused, and his second term, which had the support of 2/3 of member countries, was vetoed by the US. Since that time, every Secretary General has been closely aligned with US interests. Kofi Annan of Ghana was the next in line. He played a significant role in the Millennium Development Goals, MDGs, and even wrote the original letter that gave birth to the ESG, which is Environmental, Social and Governance Investment Ideology, in 2004. Current Secretary General Antonio Guterres of Portugal is a big advocate of the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, and has been instrumental in pushing for digital IDs, CBDCs and smart cities, all in line with the SDGs. These dystopian technologies are being promoted by unaccountable and unelected international organizations, representing the interests of both the private sector and the public sector. In the private sector, entities like the World Economic Forum, WEF, are involved. The WEF partnered with the UN to hasten the implementation of the SDGs through ESG back in 2019. On the public sector side, entities like the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank are part of the UN system. These institutions aim to influence the private sector with restrictive regulations that lead to centralized systems in developed countries and corrupt leadership in developing nations. This strategy allows developed countries to control their populations and exert influence over developing countries. The outcome of this dynamic is that very few developing countries have managed to transition into developed ones over the past half-century. According to macro analyst Lynn Alden, only 2 countries, South Korea and Taiwan, have successfully made this transition, and they are closely aligned with US interests. It's noteworthy that these countries are critical of US influence in Asia. The UN has also created various programs to provide loans to developing nations on favorable terms if they comply with the SDGs and US interests. International regulators like the Financial Action Task Force, or FATF, also play a significant role in this regard. This whole process is part of an orchestrated effort to implement the SDGs by 2030. However, the UN is worried about the public's perception and is struggling to maintain control of the narrative. The organization has even reached out to the private sector for support, as it can no longer count on the public sector to fund and endorse its initiatives. This has made concepts like digital IDs, CBDCs, and smart cities more visible to the average person. The UN's move to partner with private sector entities and its emphasis on digital initiatives like a digital army to combat misinformation and disinformation reveals a a growing concern about losing control over the narrative. However, this move has further distanced the public sector, including powerful governments that the UN is attempting to coordinate. This situation raises the question, why don't countries that are unhappy with the UN just leave? Unfortunately, it's not that simple. According to the government of Taiwan, the United Nations Charter deliberately has no provisions for member governments to withdraw. This is to prevent the threat of withdrawal from being used as a form of political leverage or to evade obligations under the Charter. The UN was established in response to the withdrawal of Japan from the League of Nations in 1933. This move was followed by the withdrawal of Germany and Italy, ultimately leading to World War II. In other words, countries can't just leave the UN because other member countries fear that it might lead to another global conflict. Interestingly, some countries have attempted to withdraw from the UN, but their efforts were unsuccessful. For instance, Indonesia tried to leave in 1965, but withdrawal had no immediate effect. The only practical example of a withdrawal from the UN was Japan in 1933, and that's a rare case. Moreover, even countries that seem eager to leave, like Russia and China, don't genuinely want to exit. In their 2015 addresses at the UN, both Russian President Vladimir Putin and Chinese President Xi Jinping made it clear that they wanted the UN to remain. This is somewhat surprising given their involvement in the BRICS group, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, which could be seen as a potential competitor to the UN. However, it's more likely that these BRICS countries are aiming to take control of the United Nations rather than form an entirely new organization. Their work on the BRICS is waiting for a significant shift, particularly in the commodity market. Should that occur, the BRICS could emerge as a bona fide alternative to the UN. BRICS countries appear to prefer influencing the member countries of the UN to vote in their favor on resolutions rather than starting from scratch with a new organization. Countries like China and Russia are actively seeking to influence other member countries to gain control of the UN. These efforts seem to be making headway, as evidenced by a map showing countries that sanctioned Russia after its invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Other than North America and Europe, the rest of the world abstained from imposing sanctions, revealing a lack of alignment with the US and its allies. To further illustrate this point, a resolution passed at a recent UN meeting to establish cooperation between the UN and China's Shanghai Cooperation Organization received significant support. 80 countries voted in favor, 47 abstained, and only 2 countries, the US and Israel, voted against it. This underscores the growing divergence between countries on the global stage. The future of the UN is uncertain. When Antonio Guterres' current term as Secretary General ends in 2027, a new Secretary General may come into power, one who is more aligned with the global South. Unless the US vetoes again, this could lead to a change in control of the de facto global government. However, this shift in leadership could bring about new challenges, and it's unclear whether the next Secretary General will be better or worse for the world. China and Russia, both candidates for leadership, are not renowned for their commitment to freedom and peace. A UN led by these nations could have its own set of problems, potentially far worse than the current situation. On the other hand, having no UN at all could lead to a much more catastrophic outcome. The United Nations, despite its imperfections, has played a vital role in maintaining international cooperation and peace. Abandoning it without a clear alternative could set the stage for further conflicts and instability. In summary, while the United Nations may seem like a global government, its current power and influence have declined, and it faces increasing challenges. The balance of power is shifting within the UN, with the developing world gaining more influence. This is partly due to the growing pushback against the policies and decisions made by the major Western powers, as countries like China, Russia, and others work to influence the UN and gain control of its resolutions. The future of the organization remains uncertain. Change may be on the horizon, but the consequences of this shift are still unknown. The UN is a complex institution with a long history, and its role in the world world will continue to evolve in response to changing global dynamics. So that's a wrap on the United Nations, a complex institution that holds significant power in the global arena, but its authority is not absolute and it faces challenges and changes as the world order evolves. The future of the UN is uncertain, and we'll have to keep a close eye on how it develops and adapts to the shifting dynamics of our world. Thanks for joining us on this exploration of the United Nations.